Yes, friends, on a Monday, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where we're your hosts, Adam Arbrecht over here, and, of course, joined by the healthy, wealthy, and wise Andy Makowitz. How are we, sir?
I am good, Adam. Tell me one really fun thing that you're doing on this President's Day, holiday that we've got in front of us.
I'm remembering that it's President's Day, for starters. So
Oh,
I'm
well,
going
that's good.
to absorb that information in real time. I'm going to digest it. And then when the podcast is over, I'm probably going to go out and I'm going to get a nice little bit of brunch with Courtney. That's how I reflect on the many presidents that have come before us. And then maybe I'll even think about Larry David from that cryptocurrency commercial. I think that that's really, even the stupid people get to vote. That's where I'm at on President's Day.
You know what I was going to say, Adam? I think people should immerse themselves in the history of America. Like,
Yeah,
for
me too.
instance, let's just give a shout out to someone like, I don't know, Chester A. Arthur, who took
Oh,
over the presidency after James Garfield died while in office. Like, these are the things that people need to remember and think about in terms of history. It's easy to go for, like, the presidents of the last 20, 30 years and say who you like and who you didn't like. Go back into the 1800s and have a look.
I just want to double check here because we're going to get into Joe Schoen's interview, talking about the off season and dive in on the cap, how he is planning on maybe getting underneath it, and everything that you have to take into account here when you're making all these big off season decisions. So that's obviously what this giant podcast is going to be about. But Chester A. Arthur, now I don't. This feels more like you just watched Die Hard with a Vengeance and you were Chester A. Arthur Middle School and you just kind of pulled that little nugget and you're trying to wrap it into a sense of, presidential history when really you're just a fan of Bruce Willis.
I wish that was the case. I thought, what's the most obscure president name that I can rattle off at the top of my head? And I just know that because he got the job because James Garfield was assassinated. Like, you got to remember those little things in history. Like, who would have known, right?
Yeah, no, listen. That's why you come to this podcast. It's not just for the football guys, or maybe it is solely for the football. Let's get into that aspect of it then, just in case. That's why somebody turned on the pod. Joe Schoen, obviously, the era has begun in New York for him. He has a big task ahead of him. We're going to talk about all those little nuances, but he gave an interview discussing all of the different layers of decision making that he has to go through, from reconstructing a roster, keeping talent on the team for this season upcoming, still clearing cap, preparing for the draft, etc. And I really thought when they were asked about what it's like to come into a situation like this and what would be the best version for a for a new GM, he said, well, that's why I'm here. I always say the jobs with Hall of Fame quarterbacks, great head coaches, and great salary cap position, those jobs don't open. You know what I mean? Because they don't. Because that means that the GM is doing a great job and the head coach is successful and the franchise quarterback is winning games, right? Like, the reason why the Giants are in open position this past offseason is because things have been going really bad for them. So, eyes open, or at least you're happy to hear that Joe Schoen walked into this job going, well, obviously it's not going to be perfect, or I wouldn't be getting the job.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't like he sat there and was like, this is the best situation I could possibly find myself in. I'm sure he could have, he's interviewed at a few different places. Like, maybe he could have gone to Jacksonville or could have gone to other places if the positions were open. It just shows a level of self-awareness. He's like, hey, look, yeah, the reason why the former guy isn't here is because it stinks right now. And my job is to come in and fix it. And it's not going to be easy. And as he said, there's going to be a lot of tough decisions that he has to make this offseason that, are going to be difficult because Giant fans either like these players or the players can contribute. But then it becomes a lot around the financials of it. And it's like there's certain breaking points with some of these players, even key starters for the Giants.
Yeah, and listen, he goes on to say when we're talking about, because we're going to get into the reason why when you have these discussions around, well, just cut this guy, just trade that guy, right? It was like, there's a little bit more to that. And it isn't so simple to say, cut him, you get money. Like, that's not the way that it works depending on the contracts. But the other caveat that I think is important here, and we've talked about it a little bit before on the podcast, of when Joe Schoen walks in the door, he doesn't necessarily have an attachment to any of these players on this roster because they're not his draft class. They're not his free agency class, right? So he said the players were paid those contracts when talking about some guys that have big numbers on the cap for the Giants. The players were paid those contracts they're making because at some point they were performing to a certain level, whether they were overvalued or maybe they got more than how their performance is dictating or not. That's where you're going to have to free up money. I don't want to purge the roster because we still want to find out what Daniel Jones can do. The fine balance, the fine line is cutting players that can really help you win, but you also got to get underneath the salary cap. Then you're going to have your draft picks come in as well. And this to me is like, we agree. Everyone understands from the opening press conference and from Dable as well. Daniel Jones is going to be afforded every single opportunity to have a fair shot here in his 4th year. But everybody else, I said this when they came in, it's a number on a spreadsheet. And there's also a value associated with the quality of play on the field. But that's all that Joe Schoen is looking at. He's doing math and saying, I need this much. I got to get to here. And it does take away the emotionality that fans have around the team, that you and I have around the team, right? Because we sit here and go, I love Saquon Barkley, or I love Daniel Jones, or I think this young player could really do it. I've been big on Lorenzo Carter, right? Like, I'd still love to see him get a chance to be with the Giants and have success. And Joe Schoen could be looking at Lorenzo Carter and going, $4.5 million on a free agency contract. Get out of here, guy. Like, it's an automatic no just from a dollars and cents standpoint. And I appreciate that. I think you have to continue to be buoyed by what Joe Schoen is saying in these interviews, because it indicates he has a real level of awareness of the process that needs to take place.
Oh, Adam.
Yes.
You may have just stepped in it just a little bit, my friend. And I didn't think you were going to do it. Yeah, but the trap was laid, and you ended up falling right into it. And that's because you gave a couple quotes from Joe Schoen.
Oh, no, it's fine. It doesn't matter. Inside of that quote, he also mentions seeing what Saquon Barkley has. He mentions Saquon Barkley. I know. But guess what? And by the way, this is actually a really good one to bring up, because this is the nuance of press conferences and interviews. And same with Daniel Jones, by the way. We think he's going to have every chance to have a fair shake. But if by week 6, Daniel Jones looks like trash, guess what? Davis Webb or somebody else is going to be under center for the New York Football Giants. Likewise, in the case of Saquon Barkley, I think the statements that Joe Schoen is making there is saying, we want to see what he has. We want to see what he's capable of. We want to see if we can tick up that trade market value for him. But by the way, we're going to get into the numbers game here. There is the right thing to do, I think, or the best option to do. And then there's the options in behind it that are still valuable, going back to last week and saying, Barkley can be on this roster, and there could be a mechanism in weeks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Yeah, the simple answer is, he said,
Nice
I don't want to purge the roster because we still want to find out what Daniel Jones can still. We still want to find out what Saquon can do. So clearly, like you said, there's nuance to these things, and he wouldn't make a statement like that. And he said we have some really good pieces on defense. When he talked about like contracts, he didn't name names of who he was going to cut, but he made it a point to single out Daniel Jones and Saquon Barkley to be like, guys, listen. They're not going anywhere for the short term. Now, like you said, can things change by week 4 or week 6? Sure. Like, Saquon might be hurt or might be traded. Daniel Jones might be benched for someone else. That's fine. But his offseason plan right now is to go in with those two as part of the pieces that he needs. And it's probably smart, because Joe Schoen talks about having this $40 million plan at him. And it's like $40 million is kind of, you feel like he's throwing the number out from thin air. But it actually makes sense when he talks about 40 million, right?
Oh, of course, right. So as it currently stands, the New York Football Giants are 10 million over the cap and needing $40 million in space. And the first spot that you can look to, it's like $40 million. Jeez, that's a lot. That's a lot of quiche to be trying to find in the couch cushions. But right off the bat, when you talk about the draft class, and then potentially at 5 and 7, if the Giants stay there, there's an enormous amount of money that needs to be allocated.
100%. And you brought up a good point. So there's about $11.5 million that's needed to sign the 5th and the 7th pick overall. It's one of the things why we may get into this later. It may even make more sense for the Giants to trade out of one of those spots, accumulate more draft assets in the future, and also lower the number that you might need to sign people. Like, there's a lot of positives about moving that 5th pick for a quarterback needy team, right?
Yeah, real quick, this is a little side note. Like, do you think, is there any world, and we'll get more and more to the draft as we get towards it, but do you think there's any world where, unique to other circumstances, where when a team wants to come for a quarterback, you go, I want your first round this year, and I want another second rounder this year, and I want, these multiple assets. I wonder if there's any world where the Giants would trade out of 7 and say, I automatically want your first rounder next year. Like, that's where I start, because it pushes the money off. Then I also want a second rounder and a third rounder in this year's draft, right? Like, maybe doing it almost reverse in terms of the order of draft capital, because it affords the Giants to say, And now the money being spent will be looked at next year, not this year.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point because, like what the Bears did, the Bears had to give up their first round pick of last year as well as this year,
Yeah,
and the
yeah.
Giants moved from 11 to 20. This year, the Giants may say, no, we don't need that first round pick back because we already have a first round pick this year. Let's take a second or a third so we can develop more talent. We need more on this roster than just another first round pick. We need 2 second rounders and a third rounder either this year or next year. Save ourselves some money, get more high end talent.
And maybe first round picks in the next 2 drafts and not this one, right? So the Giants could be set up for 2 years going forward after picking at 5 and then saying the next 2 seasons, we're going to have 2 first round picks to play with every single year. So interesting to think about those mechanics, and we'll get into that more though. In addition to the 11.5 million for those top 2 picks potentially, overall for the draft they need 17 to 18 million to sign their draft class coming in. So you're already at 20 million just to get through the draft.
And the other piece of it is, and then you're saying, well, why would we need 40 million in space? And it's very simple because you have to cut good players or contributing players in order to free up cap space. And you may say, well, that doesn't make sense, but it goes back to what Joe Schoen said before. They may have gotten these contracts that were a little bit inflated, and the performance on the field is not correlating to how much money they're getting paid. But a very simple one, and we'll get into names. I don't want to get into the weeds just yet, but a simple name like James Bradberry. He's one of our best cornerbacks. Yep. He's either 1 or 1A with Adoree Jackson, depending on how you feel about it. You know, the Giants can save a bunch of money by just releasing him. They could save $12.1 million against the cap. But when you save that $12 million, you're then without one of your top cornerbacks, and you have to go out in the market and go acquire those assets. And if the Giants, let's just say, don't take 2 offensive linemen with early picks, they're going to have to sign a guard or a tackle or something in free agency. To get a starting tackle or a starting guard in free agency, it's not $3 million, it's $10 million, it's $12 million. And that money gets eaten up very quickly to address the other holes that are more glaring on the roster.
Yeah, and it's tricky because if you think about in the case of James Bradberry, like now in a world where the Giants didn't have so many different needs across their roster, you could say, let's cut him. And in the first round, there's a lot of really talented cornerbacks worthy of top 10 picks, right? You go, we'll take one and we'll greatly reduce that, right? We'll free up 12.1 and we'll only spend, 4 or 5 million on that cornerback in the draft. But because the offensive line needs those pieces as well, going, so is that then no tackle, no guard, no center? Like that's okay. Because then the free agency for that, because those guys go about 10 million for a good one,
Right.
So
what about an edge rusher? Right? Like if you don't take one of them, how much do they cost in free agency? Like all these prime positions, like the Giants don't have a plethora of talent across all, like when we're basically taking away from one of our strong suits, which is our cornerback play, to address the massive holes that we have in other spots.
Sorry, it's the perfect blend of not only having needs on your roster, but also having them at the most critical positions that are the hardest to find. Like, right. It's like not only do the Giants need it, but also free agency is where you have to overspend for those positions, and the draft is where it's hard to get those guys, especially on offensive line play. You don't know if you're going to grab one in the second round or not, especially coming out of what they went through. So yeah, I mean, it's one of those chuckles where you go, it's just, the previous regime just keeps on giving to you blow by blow. When we turn our attention then to the way that the Giants can go about this, we talked about Barkley last week at length and what you can free up. Now, I'll just quickly mention, and there's another quote here from Joe Schoen, but the idea of there's differences in all these players on the roster. So you mentioned about, well, you can free up 12 plus million on Bradberry, but you put a hole on the roster. Even in the case of Saquon Barkley, just to be clear, and why I keep pushing for trading him is, you could say, well, what if he's really, it looks like trash in camp, right? It looks like this guy's just lost it. He's over the hill. He's playing like Jonathan Stewart. If you just straight cut him, it doesn't free up any cap room. 7.2 million coming off the books is only a possibility if you trade him to somewhere else. So like every one of these situations also has these wrinkles. In Bradberry's case, yes, you can get your hands on that money and then figure out the position. Saquon Barkley, you could release him and you get nothing for it, and you still have to find yourself another running back. So even when I do have a conviction around what I think the Giants should do, there is a very finite option to how you go about facilitating that. And Joe Schoen, just in and around contracts, I thought before we get into these players, is he said about maneuvering and also thinking about the future. Something that Dave Gettleman talked about a lot and then would tend to do the opposite of the thing that he said he was going to or not going to do, extending guys, backloading contracts, all that good stuff.
Kind of
But
like
Shane,
when he said, I didn't sign Odell Beckham to then trade him, right? Like I don't sign these guys to like huge contracts and then trade them, and then it's like
maybe I did.
next minute
Yeah,
gone.
maybe I did. Maybe I signed him just so I could wait until just after the date where it cost us an extra 15 million and really made it attractive for the Cleveland Browns. We digress, though. We don't live in the past too often. What I would like to do, said Joe Schoen, is not be in the situation where you do the big signing bonuses and you kick the can down the road. That's not ideal for me. I like to do smaller signing bonuses and then roster bonuses in later years. It gives you more flexibility. Now, granted that depending on who the player is and their circumstance, players don't necessarily want that because a roster bonus is effectively when they say, by the way, the last 2 years of your deal are non-guaranteed, and we'll go ahead and cut you and we'll save that money. But Joe Schoen is, he's at least putting that framework in place of saying, yes, I want it to be that if you're on this team and you're productive and you're playing well, I'm going to be happy to give you the roster bonus that increases the value of your contract in years 4 and years 5, potentially, whatever it may be. But what I don't want to do is saddle myself early and say, we've already spent the money. And now, regardless of what we do with you on the back end of it, we're still then saying it's like those contracts where you go, well, it's a 5-year deal, but it's really a 3-year and it really costs you 40 million over 3 years as opposed to 45 over 5, right? Like that's where I think he's trying to live of having reasonable year-to-year cap hits across this roster. So that being the case, and you can hit on that too before we get into, though, the players. I know there's a handful that you want to touch on as far as what the Giants are going to do, some automatics, and then some interesting ones they may try to look at.
Yeah. So let me just start by saying people think about players. They're like, oh, let's get rid of that guy, or we don't want this guy on the roster anymore.
Sure.
And the simple answer is it's not that simple. Like it doesn't work like that. It's not like, oh, this guy's really good, so let's just keep him, or this guy stinks, let's get rid of him. A prime example is Kenny Golladay, right? Do you know that it would cost the Giants more money this year to just outright release Kenny Golladay than to have him on the roster performing at wide receiver?
Right.
The Giants would lose out on an additional $2.5 million if they just outright cut him. So like however you feel about Kenny Golladay, he's not getting cut. Like that's not in the plans at all.
Nope.
What the two most likely scenarios are a restructure to bring his 21 point something million dollar cap hit down if they believe that he's part of the plan for the future, or it's fine if there's any trade partners willing to take Kenny Galladay's $21 million contract and hope and pray that like you can just get it off the books.
And that's a post June 1 trade that you want to do so that the cap ends up being the cap relief and savings ends up being close to 17 million. The dead cap is around 3.5. They do it pre June 1 and it's like a 13 bad, 8 good, which could still be something you want to do. But the perfect world is that you're able to do it on the post June 1. And the interesting part about that with a lot of these players is as the Giants go through the offseason and look at free agency and then do the draft and they come out of it, all of a sudden, whatever value any of these guys have, and Kenny Galladay's might be at an all-time low, and I have one more thought on him, but you'd also diminish the market if you go, we just drafted another replacement for him. Mwah, chef's kiss. Who wants to give us an asset for this player that we'd love to dump on someone, right? So then, and at that point, it may not matter to Joe Schoen. He may say, awesome, we drafted another young wide receiver. We'll take a 4th round pick for Kenny Golladay, a 5th round, a 6th round pick. It's all about getting the 17 million in cap room, but it also matters that because it's post June 1, at that point, unless there's a big name player that comes on the market, which isn't likely, then you're just saying we're giving ourselves more cap freedom going forward in the franchise, not necessarily for a move you could make this offseason.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm curious. You said you had another thing on Kenny Golladay. I wanted to hear that before I moved off of him. Was there like?
Yeah, it was just you mentioned on the restructure because we know now that when he came in on his contract, he took a very low cap hit on year 1, and it's why years 2, 3, and 4 are so big at 21 million. But then there's the 5th year on his contract that I don't know. I don't know if it's a guaranteed contract, but the way it looks, it's like it's bookended with 3.4 million on either end. And in the middle is these 3 years at 21 plus. It's interesting. Like, I wonder, is he willing to do a restructure given that he kind of structured it in that specific way, knowing he was coming in, the Giants weren't going to be able to give him the big deal if he didn't do that. Now it's a new regime. And maybe Joe Schoen can go to him and say, listen, I get what you did when you came in, but I'm here now. we're going in we could be going in a different direction. We certainly can have you be a part of it. And I wonder if the Giants, and this is what Joe Schoen spoke against, so you wouldn't think it's a viable option, where they'd say, what if we lock in that 5th year for you, right? And we take 4 or 5 million off of each of the next 3 seasons and put it into the final year of the contract. Now that would go against guaranteed money, or he wants to put it as a roster bonus, whatever it is. But in Kenny Galladay's situation specifically, you could free up 4 to 5 million over these next 3 seasons if you just say, we'll give you it'd be 15 million in the, in that 5th year, and we'll deal with that when the time comes, because everything can't be done perfectly. I wonder if that's something that they would try to process through.
Yeah, I mean, the tough part is, you just mentioned it, is about leverage, and Kenny
Yeah.
Galladay has a whole lot of leverage over the Giants right now, because the Giants will actually lose money if they cut him, right? So if you're Kenny Galladay, you're like, what's in it for me? Like, what will guarantee, what do I need in order to help you guys in the financial situation of the team overall? Because
If they
my
felt
cap
good
hit is
going
very high.
forward, do you think that they would just trade him for like nothing after June 1? Like if they felt like the position was secure, let's just assume whatever happens, right? They have a nice wide receiver core. Do you think that they would just trade him for a 6th round pick and say, we're trading him for $17 million in cap room? That's what we're doing.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, there's another wide receiver on this roster that we'll talk about in a second, but I think that cap space would be tremendous, and you could go out in the 2nd or 3rd round. We have multiple, 3rd round picks, and go pick up a talented wide receiver to go develop with Kenny Galladay. I think that would be a home run on Joe Schoen's part to move off of Kenny Galladay's contract. Aside from Kenny Galladay, though, there's a couple of other guys that we need to talk about. It's much, 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 much more likely that Sterling Shepard is no longer going to be a Giant when all is said and done. And it's because of the cap savings that the Giants could have. And listen, there's 2 different ways that you could go about it. If it's a pre-June 1st, the Giants can save about $4.5 million on Sterling Shepard coming off a terrible leg injury. If it's a post-June 1st, they save $8.5 million, and then they basically push, 3 or 4 million into dead cap the following year. So either way, you're talking about $4 or $8 million on a often injured wide receiver in Sterling Shepard, who happens to be the longest tenured Giant, by the way. I think it's a no-brainer that he can't be part of this roster anymore, because that money is just needed in so many other areas, rather than a slot wide receiver who ends up playing 6 to 8 games a year.
Yeah, and I talked about this, little shameless plug. You can go over to Substack at adamarmbrecht.substack, and I'm starting to do some articles, taking some longer view pictures of things that would be a little bit dry to discuss on the podcast in full. But the one thing I highlighted was, and I don't know if Joe Schoen would be interested in this, is they can restructure his contract to free up 3.7 million this year, and then still go right back to the next off season and cut him from the team. Now, whether or not coming down to 8.8 and change on the books would be viable, I think at least in the short term, you'd say, well, here's money for us now, and then if we get after June 1 and it ends up being a cut, it ends up being a release, whatever, we can still make that decision at that point. The only wrinkle to that is the date for when you say you have to get underneath the cap by X date, right? Everything ahead of that, the Giants could be 40 million over the cap threshold, and then in one swoop make every move necessary to get underneath it. So freeing up 3.7 doesn't necessarily matter when you accomplish, right? Freeing up the money by whatever mechanism. But I'd be curious if that's on the table for them, just in the sense of he obviously has no value. I don't even think if he came back healthy, he would necessarily have trade value. But in the world where, just like Kenny Galladay, what if we can save 3.7 on the cap this year with Shepard, and he shows anything over the first few weeks? And again, you go 7th round pick, somebody just wants a veteran wide receiver, take a flyer on him. Great. We'll do that before the trade deadline, right? Like, I wonder how much of these guys Shane will be willing to wait to see if you can get anything for, or because we know there's only so many options here, at some point you go, I need the money.
Well, I think Joe Schoen will be smart in saying, hey, do you want to take a pay cut? And,
Yes.
there's questions to be had of a lot of guys before you end up cutting them. But as everyone says, the second you approach a player and ask them to take a pay cut, you need to be prepared to lose them and outright release them if they say no, because you have no credibility left if you say, hey, will you take a pay cut? And they're like, nope. And you're like, okay, that sounds good. You could stick around on this roster, my friend, keeping that same amount of money. So there's tough questions between how we want to do it with Sterling Shepard, what we want to do with Blake Martinez, considering releasing him can save about $8.5 million.
What's your stance on him?
I think it's not so cut and dry on Blake Martinez. He is a little bit of an getting older linebacker coming off of a terrible leg injury again, and the Giants can save significant amount of money to be able to address other positions and then go get another young linebacker in the 3rd or 4th round to like plug that in. I think it's going to be tough unless he really wants to be a Giant to have him on the roster.
I don't think he's going to be on the roster because I don't think he fits Wink Martindale's system, right? Like this is
Right.
he's not a sideline to sideline linebacker. He's a north and south plug the holes. Now, it doesn't mean he can't have a role inside of Wink Martindale's system. But you talk about an inside linebacker in the 3-4 setup. You want this guy to be the general of the field, which Blake Martinez can be, but you also need him to be a guy that can do everything, right? He's not a drop back and coverage linebacker. So if you talk about he's in that same kind of range as Shepard when it comes to the dead cap versus cap freedom that he gives you, he to me makes a lot of sense to say, boom, we're taking that off the books, and then immediately Wink, like, hey, tell me free agency, tell me in the draft, who's a guy that we can plug in here to start to turn over that side of the ball.
So I think that Blake Martinez is someone for up for debate. I think Sterling Shepard, there's a couple of questions on how you may do it. There's a couple players that will absolutely not be on this roster. And we can say it with like, if Vegas is giving you odds on this, you may as well put the money down because it is 100% a fact. Kyle Rudolph will not be on this team next year.
Slice.
He $7 million against the cap. The Giants saved $5 million by outright cutting him. You save $5 million on a guy that caught 20 balls last year. Like, he will not be here. Set it and forget it. No reason to even think about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
The second one is Riley Dixon. The Giants can save about $2.5 million by cutting their punter and only having $300K in dead cap savings. And oh, by the way, they already signed the former Buffalo Bills punter and former Cleveland Browns punter to our futures reserve contract. So they already have a punter who has NFL experience on a veteran minimum for the cheap, waiting in the wings.
He's not very good, by the way, but he is there.
Oh, but I mean, it's not like Riley Dixon was barely average last year. We were paying him $2.5 million.
Yeah.
Adam, here I have another one that we haven't talked about, and this one I would put significant money Vegas odds on, and you might be shocked by this.
Okay, shock me.
I don't believe Devontae Booker is going to be on this roster come next season. And the reason why is twofold. One, the Giants can save over $2 million on their backup running back against the cap by cutting him outright. And you may say, well, like, Saquon Barkley, not a given, who knows, injury history. That's great. The Giants also went out and signed Antonio Williams from the Buffalo Bills practice squad to a future reserve contract because they loved how much they saw from him. Instead of doing things the way that you wanted to, where they, trade away Saquon Barkley and save $7.5 million, they're going to keep Saquon, save $2 million in their running back room, and have some young, promising guys, along probably with one other guy that they take in the draft, and you were able to shave $2 million off of the running back room.
Yeah, I don't mind that. I get it. Like I said, go back to last offseason. I said it's a good signing. The money was a good contract, and I still stand by that. And also, you're a veteran running back, and it's a new regime. I wouldn't take any issue if they moved on from him. They do take a $1 million dead cap hit on that, which is a relatively small number. But it's like in talking about him, which I think is fine. But this is all the trimming the fat around the edges of the Christmas turkey, right? Like, or ham, I guess would be the better example. Like, none of these things are enough, right? So even when you say it's like, is it a foregone conclusion that Kyle Rudolph is going to be gone? Yes, that frees up $5 million. Is it a foregone conclusion? Let's just say that Booker will be gone. Great. Now you're up to a little bit more than $7 million. Now you're up to $9 million with Riley Dixon. Like, okay, those 3 moves get you to even. Now you're no longer 10. Now you're no longer in the negative. But how do you get the $40 million? That's the question here. And to bring it back around, and I don't know if you have more players you want to touch on, but to bring it back around to the top of this conversation is getting rid of, James Bradbury in some form or fashion, Kenny Golladay, these big names with big numbers attached to them. One guy we didn't mention, and I'll hit on him right now, is Logan Ryan, right? This is something that people have talked about around veteran experience. You want to bring in guys or keep guys on the roster that potentially can teach the young players the new system, and Logan Ryan has certainly been in a number of them. While right now, on a pre-June cut, it would cost you a massive dead cap hit and free up absolutely nothing. Cutting on a post-June one for him would free up, as even that one's a bad dead cap hit. This is going to be one of those trade opportunities, because I always get caught up inside of these. These are ones that I wonder about where the money there on a post-June trade, that's where you can get value on Logan Ryan, freeing up $9 million, only taking 2.9 in dead cap. Now, the question becomes on a lot of these, can you wait that long, right? And I don't know what Joe Schoen, when he says, I don't want to hurt our future opportunities and take on too much dead cap. We know they're gonna have a ton of cap room next year. Where do you draw the line on that? Like, to your point, right? It's like, at a certain date, is it worth it just to cut Kenny Galladay for the cap room? Maybe, like, or Logan Ryan, maybe, like all these guys. But more than likely, I think what you're seeing here is saying we know we need to free up some cap room, and we need to get to the offseason and training camp. And then it's the post June 1. Post June 1 to me is where everything would start to happen for them. If they like what they do in the draft and free agency, then they look at these veteran names, they look at the number, and they say, we need to get below the cap. Now it's your time to go, right? Whether it's through trade or cut, now we need to free up these big bulks. Like, I have this weird sense, I don't know if you agree, that all of these significant moves are going to happen in one swoop when it comes time, because everything leading up to that is, what do we think who can we get veteran minimums in free agency? What do we accomplish in the draft? And now all the way through camp, do some of these young players look like they can replace a Logan Ryan? Do they look like this? Do we get a cornerback that we think can replace James Bradbury? Now all of a sudden you might be willing to take diminished returns on getting these guys off the books if you think you have other replacements in place.
Yeah, well, Adam, it's tough because there's a few things that we've talked about. We're talking about outright releasing players. We're talking about trading players like James Bradbury, who, if he gave you a third round pick back, maybe you could free up that 13, 14 million dollars off of it. That would be huge to get a young, cheap asset and to be able to free up that money. But we haven't even mentioned the door number 3, which is what Joe Schoen wants to avoid. And that's restructuring guys that you think are going to be here for more than the next year or two. Like the Giants, if they go to Kenny Galladay and they're like, I know he doesn't like giving out these big roster bonuses up front, but he could move money around and they could save $5 to almost $8 million on Kenny Galladay's contract. They could save $4 to $6 million in cap savings this year by restructuring Leonard Williams. They could save millions of dollars if they want to keep Blake Martinez around. Right there, you're talking about $15 million. That's where you get that chunky money.
Mm-hmm.
But again, when you restructure, you kind of kick the can a little bit. And while the Giants have 80 or 90 million in cap space going into 2023, maybe you use a little bit of that security blanket to get through some of these tough contracts of people that you know aren't going to be on this roster in a year.
Yeah, and you bring up a couple of good ones there. Like some of the older, like Kenny Galladay, I just cannot see you restructuring his contract, because that to me is like a wide receiver who's had injuries, who's going to be over 30 on the back end of his contract. You don't want to be locked into that money and guaranteed money potentially on the back end. But Leonard Williams is a great example. They could extend him and free up 14 million this year and 13 million next year. And it may not matter for next year. They're going to have a lot of cap room, but that right there, what if you just extend Leonard Williams, who's in the prime of his career, and you consider he can very much be an effective piece inside of Martindale's system, right? If you like him and you believe he's one of the cornerstone guys, which is something we haven't really talked about, right? We're saying all these players that are here from the previous regime and anybody could go or come or whatever. I do think Leonard Williams can represent, because he's the right age and he's the right position and the right skill set, where you go, oh, yes, he can carry forward and be a part of what happens here. That's a nice one. If you can extend him, and there's a restructure option there too, same difference. But if you can extend him and free up 14 million, now you're talking, because now you add it to what we talk about, some of these fringe guys. Well, now you're up to 25 million that you've accomplished here, right? So out of getting back even and then freeing up the additional 40, you're well on your way just by doing one move like that. And in his case, I really like it. In Kenny Galladay's, I would hate it. In James Bradbury's, and he's already done it once. And that's the other interesting thing too. Specifically in Bradbury's case, while you're going to need to replace him, I think that you're at a point now where Bradbury's at the right age. He's talented, and he may look at it as, now, would I be getting 21 million from a team on the open market? Of course not. Or whatever his number is coming into this year. I just gave you Kenny Galladay's. But would I be getting the same number? Maybe not. But I'm still good. So getting me to a competitive team, maybe he wants to be on a team competing, right, for a championship. He has a real nice, I think, trade package option if you can replace him. And that was the one other piece that I wanted to just quickly touch on was, what if you can trade guys and get back players as well, right? Now, it doesn't mean you're going to replace James Bradbury as your 1A cornerback, but just any of these guys you're looking to move off of, if you can get back a player at a position of need, someone that helps you bolster the roster, raise the floor of the talent level, that's going to be something I think that Joe Schoen would look at as well. It's just going to be interesting to see who they go to and who wants to be around on this roster versus guys that look at it understandably and say, I'm out. I'm 27, 28, 29 years old. I'm not here for a 2-year rebuild. Like, let me go compete somewhere else. Let me help you move my money.
It's a simple assumption to draw, but look at the Las Vegas Raiders as a prime destination for James Bradberry in trades.
Yeah.
Patrick Graham was with him for a few years. Patrick Graham sought him out to bring him to the Giants. If he still believes in him, that's an easy connection to be able to make. Giants can free up money, maybe get a cheaper asset. Adam, at the end of the day, when we talk about all of these different things the Giants need to do, it's like a puzzle that Joe Schoen is trying to put the right pieces together to make a beautiful picture or a portrait of what the next season looks like. And I don't think there's necessarily a right or a wrong path that you can go down. Each of these decisions, though, does cascade. It's like a domino effect. Like, if we do get rid of James Bradberry, that is a big chunk of money that maybe allows us to keep Blake Martinez on a restructure or do something else. Like, there are some,
or go sign a guard in free agency that says, now we need one less piece in the draft there. Now we can allocate maybe for a cornerback at that position of need, right?
Exactly. There's all these different little moves. And like I said, it's kind of a domino effect in terms of like who's going to stay, who's going to go on this roster. What we'll do, I think, is you talked about how this is all going to, with the snap of the fingers, be like a flurry of activity. What's going to be important is we'll get into some of the key dates that are going to be approaching in the offseason. For instance, on March 18th, $2 million of James Bradberry's salary becomes guaranteed by the Giants. The Giants will have to make a decision before March 18th on someone like James Bradberry, because why would you guarantee him the $2 million if he's not going to be in your future plans?
No, 100%. And so that'll be tomorrow's episode, I think. We'll break down when some of the money starts to solidify on the cap this year for the Giants and what it would mean. $2 million guaranteed for James Bradberry. Well, if you trade or cut him in, it's going to take a massive dead cap hit. Does the $2 million matter or not? We'll find out. But we'll lay out all that for you here. As I said, you can the YouTube, man, we've been having great numbers over there. We appreciate it. Get in on the comments, ask your questions. We'll answer those as often as we can, probably even work themselves into the show sometimes, wherever you get your podcast needs fulfilled. And if you hit up that Substack, Adam Armbrecht, you'll find, I think, the wider net being cast. And then when we get to the podcast, I'm going to be giving Andy some names, some value buys in free agency potentially to replace some of these stars, and seeing whether or not Joe Schoen has targets that can effectively bring down the cap and still keep this team competitive in the season ahead. Oh, that was a juicy one, friends. Enjoy it. Enjoy your President's Day. Enjoy your Chester A. Arthur research, if that's what you're into. And as Andy Makowitz, every day, not just President's Day, all days of the year, would want, need, and nay, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.